I'm a philosopher by academic training who specialised in philosophy of religion, and then I moved into a ministry in Christian apologetics, and of course that's an extremely broad field. I've written a number of things about the historical Jesus and kind of New Testament issues, but you'll also have noticed I was here at the conference this year doing a 2-day pre-forum on the Old Testament historical narratives and the evidence for the Old Testament historical narratives as well. So look out for those videos when they become available. But let's jump into looking at Jesus, and particularly looking at archaeological evidence and Jesus. As you will know, we live in an age where people make a lot of uninformed, incorrect claims about Jesus. There's a lot of misinformation around in culture, a lot of misunderstanding. People will take on board ideas like Jesus probably didn't exist, an idea spread, for example, by the new atheist Victor Stenger, or that the Gospels are just works of fiction, as British atheist Richard Dawkins calls them. Or they might take on board the idea that people thinking of Jesus as divine was actually an innovation, a new thing, decided upon at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, an idea many people would have got from Dan Brown's best-selling conspiracy mystery kind of novel, The Da Vinci Code, or the film of that book. Now, archaeology is a really interesting place to go to address those kind of concerns, because you're moving on kind of secularly acceptable grounds, as it were, to address them, and you can kind of get there more directly than perhaps if you want to start talking to people about, well, what's all of the issues involved in the textual and historical reliability of the biblical texts that tell us about Jesus and so on. I think you can absolutely do that, and I do that in my written work, but it's going to take a bit more time. And when you talk to people about archaeology, you're kind of working from that secularly comfortable ground already, and you can show people pretty pictures, which is always a bonus. So archaeology is simply the systematic study of the material remains of past human behaviour. And this talk will kind of fold into that category texts on solid objects. So inscriptions or writing on bits of pottery, those kind of texts. So not kind of literary texts on papyri, but texts on solid objects, if I can put it that way. But we'll be kind of ignoring written evidence from books and letters. So I'm not going to look at what did Josephus or Tacitus say, what the Jewish or Roman historians of the first century say about Jesus, but just looking at the kind of material objects that we have thus far discovered from the time of Jesus. And there's a kind of overall argument that kind of draws all this together, and what a philosopher or a lawyer might call a cumulative case. American Christian philosopher Lydia McGrew puts it this way with quite a nice illustration from her book Hidden in Plain View on some of the evidence for the New Testament. She says, if you sample a loaf of bread on both ends, that's okay, and at several points in the middle, and you find that it's good, it would be caviling, it would be being overly sceptical, unreasonably sceptical of you, to then say that perhaps just the parts you haven't tasted happen to be the mouldy ones. Or to put this another way, if you've got a witness, and every time that you are able to externally check what they're saying, it turns out that what they're saying is true, and you do that enough times, you should start building up a general confidence in that source of testimony, in that person's testimony. It would be being overly sceptical to say, yeah, I know they've always been right when I've been able to check them, but they're probably wrong about the things that I can't check, right? Because you build up a kind of general confidence. So archaeology, or any kind of stream of empirical evidence, isn't going to be able to, evidence, let alone prove, in a kind of mathematical sense, everything in the Gospels, say. But it can build up your general confidence in its testimony. I think that's what's the kind of reasonable standard to expect that kind of discipline to give you. And I think that indeed is what the archaeological discipline gives us with respect to the historical Jesus and the textual sources of testimony that we have from the first century original Christians. So let's divide this into kind of three broad categories. Some I'll delve into deeper than others, but if you go to my books, website, etc., you'll be able to find more information on areas that I haven't gone so deeply into if you are interested in those. So let's look at what archaeology can tell us about historical places from the Gospels and Jesus' life, historical people from his life, and historical culture, the culture of his day. And in terms of places, we can look at like whole cities down to individual buildings. In terms of people, you can look at kind of general kind of titles of people that would have in positions, what sort of titles were used, or specific named people, their titles and relationships even to each other sometimes. And in historical culture, that's about the kind of the cultural background and stuff, interestingly, we'll see about the cultural beliefs of the first generations of Christians. So let's start with places and start at the beginning, at Bethlehem. This is a very enlarged view of a tiny seal impression that mentions Bethlehem. Eli Shukron from 2012 says, here we can read the word Bethlehem in a clear Hebrew inscription from the first temple period on a boule, one of these little seal impressions found in Israel that arrived from Bethlehem to Jerusalem, maybe about paying some taxes. This is the Bethlehem next to Jerusalem referred to in the Bible. There had been some question about when Bethlehem was a real place, because obviously you can go to Bethlehem now, but when was it a real place? And this is saying, well, it was a real place in the first temple period, so that gives some credence to it being a real place during Jesus' day as well. More so than if you had no evidence, right? Or where Jesus actually kind of grew up in Nazareth. Again, people had had skeptical questions over whether Nazareth was even a place. And this is some excavations from 2010. We're looking down upon, as you often do in archaeology, a series of small walls. That's what archaeologists often get excited about, is uncovering a series of small walls, because then they go, this is a house, and this is the house next to it, and this is the purpose of these rooms, and that shows that people were living here, and what was their culture, and what pottery and things can we get out of the levels, and can we work out, and it often is through the kind of what level are you digging things up at, and what kind of material culture comes along with it, that you can work out the dating of that series of small walls. And like, this is a series of small walls from Nazareth from the time of Jesus, right? And then that becomes a more interesting series of small walls, right? So excavation director Yardina Alexander says the discovery is of the utmost importance since it reveals for the very first time a house from the Jewish village of Nazareth, and thereby sheds light on the way of life at the time of Jesus. The building that we found is small and modest and is most likely typical of the dwellings in Nazareth in that period. Now, this is a photograph of the synagogue in Capernaum. There are 16 references to Capernaum in the Gospels. And they say that Jesus taught in the synagogue there in Mark chapter 1, in Luke chapter 4, it says Jesus was teaching in the synagogue. Now, the white stone here is a 3rd or 4th century structure. So that's after Jesus' day. But it seems that they built this newer synagogue on the same site as the older one, this 1st century black basalt foundation. And they had a synagogue there, and then they're like, oh, our synagogue's beginning to get a bit tatty or whatever, or needs repairing for whatever reason. Why didn't we, whilst we're at it, let's build a new one. But we'll just build it on top of the same foundations as the last one. And of course, that's what you often find in archaeology, that people build on top of where people already are. And as you dig down through, often you'll find in biblical archaeology, people talking about a tell or a kind of a man-made mound. It's a mound that, like, there was a town there, and then they built a town on top of the town, and a town on top of the town on top of the town, and gradually you get these kind of man-made mounds, and then you kind of dig a trench in the mound, and you're going down, and you can go through. We're now going. The lower you go, the further back through history you're going. But here we have the 1st century foundations of the synagogue in Capernaum from Jesus' day. So when it says, he taught in the synagogue there, archaeology can kind of help verify that, well, yes, there was a synagogue in 1st century Capernaum. Or indeed what's called Peter's house. In Capernaum, there was the remains of an octagonal 5th century church. And in 1968, archaeologists discovered the remains of a 4th century AD church under that 5th century AD church. And then they discovered that 4th century church had been built around what was a 1st century house in Capernaum. And they're like, why would anyone build a church around a 1st century house in Capernaum, rather than just like, let's build a church? Then they're like, that house, let's build a church around it. It seems to be a site that would have been associated in the kind of historical memory of the place with something significant. It seems that this 1st century house had been used as a Christian meeting place since about the second half of the 1st century. There are, for example, prayers, Christian prayers, scratched in the plasterwork of that house there. And indeed, we know that Agira, who was the Emperor Constantine's mother, who was kind of like, started off the trend for kind of like tourist pilgrimage around the Holy Land to see the sites, going around kind of asking the local Christians, like, where are the sites? And in AD 380, she wrote in her kind of like travel diary, in Capernaum, the house of the Prince of the Apostles has been made into a church, with its original walls still standing. It's where the Lord cured the paralytic. And it's kind of generally accepted that this was probably Peter's house where Jesus cured the paralytic in Capernaum. So there's just a few samples of that kind of category of what archaeology can tell us about. But let's look at people. And let's just focus on, what could archaeology tell us related to Luke chapter 3, verses 1 and 2? Because here is a verse from Luke where he's being very deliberate about situating the narrative that he's telling in its wider historical context and name-dropping people that his patron, who's paid him to write this book, as you see in the beginning of Luke, would know about. And I'm situating this for you like a good historian would. So Luke says, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when 2, Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, 3, Herod was tetrarch, that means the governor of a quarter of a province, of Galilee, his brother Philip, tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, and that's actually mentioned, this is my one historian extra reference, mentioned in Josephus in Jewish Antiquities. And for Licinius was tetrarch of Albany. During the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, son of Zechariah, in the desert. So he name drops a lot of names, some of them quite famous names. He gives them titles, he gives them relationships to each other. He's very specific. So let's start with one, Tiberius Caesar. Of course, because he's emperor, we've got lots of archaeology relating to him. There's a bust of him. Here is a coin with his face on it. This is the famous Tiberius denarius coin. This one was minted in about 14 to 37 AD. It's commonly referred to as the tribute penny because, of course, this is the, whose image is on the coin. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's. This is the coin, or an example of the coin that Jesus would have used. It may even be the coin, I don't know, but we couldn't prove that. The coin shows the portrait of Tiberius Caesar. And then Pontius Pilate, of course, there's a quite famous Pontius Pilate inscription. Pilate seems to have paid for a Tiberium, a temple to the emperor. And of course, to make sure he got his brownie points, he put an inscription on it saying, I paid for this, O emperor, right? Favour me. But this stone had then been, the temple had been kind of discombobulated and taken apart, and this stone had been reused in another building. But someone spotted that this stone seems to have some writing on it. What's this? What's this all about? And the bits in square brackets, you'll often find this in kind of archaeological contexts. Those bits have to be kind of reconstructed on the message because it's either like missing or kind of badly scratched or eroded or whatever, and you have to do a little bit of guesswork, but like what's the most plausible guesswork of filling in the missing parts of the jigsaw puzzle when you've got quite a lot of the rest of the jigsaw, right? So they think it says something about Tiberium, Pontius Pilatus Prefectus. So Pontius Pilate, prefect. So not only the name, but the title that Luke uses. A Latin inscription from the 1st century AD, discovered in 1961 in Caesarea Maritima, a coastal resort of sorts. 3, Herod the Great. Now, Thomas Paine had said that there could be no such person as King Herod, because the Jews and their country were then under the dominion of the Roman emperors, who governed them by tetrarchs or governors like Pontius Pilate. So there couldn't have been a King Herod. Here's a bronze coin of Herod the Great. On the obverse side, on the bottom there, is a picture of a tripod with a ceremonial bowl on top of it, and the inscription reads, Herod, King. And the year that the coin was struck in, which was year 3 of his reign, which puts this coin coming from 37 BC. So there is extra-biblical proof that there was a King Herod. In 1996, Israeli professor of archaeology Ehud Netzer discovered some broken pottery in Masada with a Latin inscription written on it, and the inscription read, Herod the Great, King of the Jews, or King of Judea. This was the first find to mention the full biblically used title of King Herod. So not only is Luke right to say that there was a King Herod, but he gets the title right. This was pottery was part of an amphora, a vessel for carrying wine, probably, that comes from about 19 BC. What about Licinius? Now, again, some scholars here were a bit skeptical because they said Luke doesn't know what he's talking about because everybody knows, well, at least who's had a classical education, that Licinius wasn't a tetrarch. Licinius was ruler of Chalcis, half a century before Jesus. So Luke must have got it wrong. But then later archaeologists discovered an inscription from the time of Tiberius, between 14 and 37 AD, which names someone called Licinius as, guess what, tetrarch in Albia near Damascus. So there'd been two government officials with the same name. Caiaphas. This is the ossuary or the bone box of Caiaphas. You know, the Jewish practice in the first century was when you died, you put the dead body on a shelf in a rock-cut tomb. You went away, you let the body decompose, you came back later, you gathered up the bones, and you put them into an ossuary like this, kind of to make space for the next family member who's going to join in the Being Dead Club. In a tomb located to the south of Jerusalem were discovered several ossuaries, one of which many historians believe relates to the former high priest Caiaphas and his family. On the side, it's quite an ornate, you can see this must be someone who's quite rich and powerful. On the side and back of the ossuary is inscribed, I don't know if you can make out the inscription here in the light, but there's an inscription at the top there. Is inscribed Caiaphas' name, and the inscription is Yosef bar Caiapha, so it's about Joseph, son of Caiaphas. And then 6, let me introduce to you the Bulgarian bone box of John the Baptist. I think that's a great name. I would take this one perhaps with a pinch of salt more than the others, but I mention it because John's in the list, and this is, if there is any archaeology relating to John, this is probably it, but I would say I'm a little bit more sceptical about this than the others here. But an archaeologist called Dr. Pop Konstantinov, I thought I'd go to mangle that, Pop Konstantinov headed an archaeological team that uncovered this reliquary, or ancient container for relics, in which 8 bone pieces attributed to John the Baptist were found, although it was discovered that some of those bone pieces were not human. It was now, often with like medieval relics and things, people would big up the collection, The reliquary was found, though, embedded in an altar in the ruins of a monastery on Sveti Ivan, a small island in the Black Sea off Sozopol in Bulgaria. And that basically means John Island, I believe. Professor Pop Konstantinov told the media that he bases his support for the find's authenticity on a Greek inscription found on another box that was found with this reliquary. And the inscription said, God save your servant Thomas to St. John, June 24th. Now, June 24th happens to be the religious feast day of St. John the Baptist. And the island's name, the monastery's dedication to St. John, the fact that they then got this bone box and John being mentioned and his feast day being mentioned in this kind of reliquary collection leads him to think that maybe this is authentic. Now, as I said, not all of the bones were human, but some of them were, like knuckle bones, and so they sent some of the knuckle bones to be radiocarbon dated to see what date do these come from. Oxford University archaeologists undertook carbon dating tests, and the research team dated the right-hand knuckle bone to the middle of the 1st century AD, which is, of course, when John is believed to have lived until he was beheaded by orders of King Herod. So, again, it kind of passes that test as well. So, maybe. Let me introduce you to 3 additional names in a much less ornate ossuary, but one that has been more controversial, but I think we've good reason now to think is authentic. On this mid-1st century AD chalk ossuary, part of the reason it was controversial is that, some things archaeologists dig up in situ, in the dig. Other things kind of end up in people's private collections on the antiquities market. And of course, some people try and make fakes in order to con money out of other people. And so if something isn't dug up in situ, there's a bit more of a question mark over its authenticity. But this guy in Jerusalem evidently had this box in his shop for a long time, and he didn't, being a Jew, he didn't particularly pay much attention to the inscription on it, didn't think it was particularly significant. And then a visitor to the shop noticed this inscription, and the inscription, which, Hebrew reading right to left, is Jacob bar Yosef Achad Yeshua. Jacob bar Yosef Yachad Yeshua. James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. Now, it's usual to put, like, so-and-so, son of so-and-so, as we saw with the Caiaphas box, but it's quite unusual to put another person's name on the box. That, again, it suggests that that must have been something quite significant to do that on the inscription. It's mid-1st century. We know that James was martyred mid-1st century. That would tie in. And this combination of names, and people have done like statistics on how many people in the 1st century from the material remains that we have and all of these inscriptions on ossuaries and so on, what's the kind of name frequency of people named James, of people named Joseph, of people named Jesus? What is the statistical likelihood of 3 people with these names in this family relationship, and so on? And so I don't have time to go into that, nor the mathematical inclination, but mathematicians have done it. And they kind of say, well, it's not overwhelming, but it's pretty unlikely. James was martyred in AD 62. So that would date this ossuary to about 63. But then there was a whole court case about this in Israel, because the Jewish Antiquities Authority took the guy who owned the shop to court, accusing him of forgery. But interestingly, then the court case fell apart, and the witnesses for the prosecution ended up giving testimony that supported the authenticity of the find. It was something that was kind of big news at the time in the archaeology world, and if you were following like editions of the Biblical Archaeology Review magazine at the time, when a Jew named Herschel Shanks was the editor. He died a few years ago now. But that magazine really kind of followed the case and actually championed the authenticity of this find. And then in 2014, there was a peer review journal article in the Open Journal of Geology that also supported the authenticity of the ossuary. And it said, not only is this a 1st century ossuary, but the full inscription is ancient, because people had wondered, maybe someone found an ossuary with the so-and-so son of so-and-so on it, and then scratched in brother of Jesus on it to kind of zhuzh it up, right? But they said, no, the patina, the layer of dirt and grime and things that collects in scratches over the years for the entire inscription was consistent with the entire inscription being ancient. The way in which various scratches and dents that had happened to the ossuary when some roof tiles had fallen on it at some stage. Some of those scratches went across different bits of the inscription and things in ways that supported the authenticity. If you want to look up that paper, you can find it online because it's open access, the authenticity of the James ossuary in the Open Journal of Geology from 2014. There's Herschel Shanks, who I mentioned. He was the editor-in-chief of Biblical Archaeology Review magazine. He said, this box is more likely the ossuary of James, the brother of Jesus of Nazareth, than not. In my opinion, it's likely that this inscription does mention the James and Joseph and Jesus of the New Testament. American historian Paul L. Mayer likewise says there is strong, though not absolutely conclusive, evidence that yes, the ossuary and its inscription are not only authentic, but that the inscribed names are the New Testament personalities. And I notice one thing that I'm repeatedly doing here is not trying to oversell any of the evidence. I'm trying to be responsible in terms of saying, this is generally accepted, this has had some controversy about it, this is like more likely than not authentic, and so on. You don't get kind of knockdown arguments in history, and shouldn't expect it, and shouldn't kind of try and oversell to an audience, because then their baloney meters will go off. You want to be kind of responsible in communicating, like, this is the evidence, and this is, the strength of the evidence, and that varies from bit to bit, and some things are more controversial than others, and archaeologists and historians are always arguing about the interpretation of things, but then, so are cosmologists and other kinds of physicists and so on. And finally, let's look at this category of historical culture. Just one example in terms of the background culture, because I think it's fascinating. The first century fishing boat. There was a drought in Israel in 1986, which caused the waters of the Sea of Galilee to recede. And two local fishermen, who just coincidentally happened also to be amateur archaeologists, were taking a walk at the time, and they discovered this boat buried in the mud of the Sea of Galilee. And of course, the mud had preserved the timbers. I grew up in Portsmouth in England. Portsmouth is where the flagship of Henry VIII, the Mary Rose, had sailed out to battle, and they'd had the gun ports opened, and they had lots of cannons and people on board. It was really heavily laden. The gun ports were opened. They turned a corner, and the gun ports went under the water, and the water came on board, and it became heavier and heavier, and it sunk. Oops. And it went down, but half of that ship got buried in the mud. And in the 1980s, there was a big archaeological project to raise the Titanic. No, to raise the Mary Rose. And I remember as a kid watching them very slowly and gradually raising it up. And one summer I worked as a tour guide on the Mary Rose as they had this half a ship on its side, spraying it with water and preservatives to kind of get it to a state where they would be able to display it dry and it not crumble. And similarly here, having found this boat, there was a big kind of emergency. We need to dig it up, but we need to dig it up and preserve it and keep it wet and things so that it doesn't crumble away. We need to get a preservation project going, and they managed to do that. And it's a really well-preserved fishing boat from the time of Jesus. It measures 27 feet long. So when you think, the disciples of Jesus, they went out fishing on a boat. This is the kind of size of boat that they probably would have been on, typical of fishing boats used during the time in the Eastern Mediterranean. Various pots and lamps were found beside the boat, which helped to date it, and that again was confirmed by radiocarbon dating, because wood, organic material. In the back of the boat, there's a raised section, like that under which Jesus is described as sleeping on, a better translation here is probably the ballast sandbag. At least in English, some English translations say, Jesus was asleep on the pillow. Like, I've taken a little comfy pillow with me in case I need a nap on the boat. Now, this is like the ballast sandbag from this working fishing boat, and he was sleeping on the bag in the kind of the ballast sandbag storage compartment at the back, which is a really interesting detail relating to Mark 4:38. And the boat could easily accommodate about 15 people on board, so there would have been plenty of room for Jesus and his 12 disciples, for example. Now, according to Jesus mythicists are very skeptical about Jesus. They think of him as just a myth, basically. Robert Price says that there's a major collision between the gospel tradition and archaeology. Conflict concerns the existence of synagogues and Pharisees in the pre-70 CE or 70 AD, mean the same thing, in Galilee. Price says historical logic implies that there would not have been no synagogues in that time period, since Pharisees fled to Galilee only after the fall of Jerusalem, which happened when the Romans attacked and Jerusalem fell in 70 AD. Now that's from his book, The Incredible Shrinking Son of Man, from 2003. It says that this conflict in the archaeology. But actually it's an argument from silence. What he's saying is we don't have any archaeological evidence of synagogues in that area in the first century. And then saying that absence of evidence is the same thing as evidence for their absence. And that's a very risky argument to make. And when you make arguments like that, you open yourself up to things like this. In 2021, the University of Haifa announced the discovery of a first century synagogue in Magdala in Israel. Although this is one of only a handful, there are a handful, of synagogues from the first century excavated in the Galilee, it is remarkably not the first uncovered in the ancient city of Magdala. Another synagogue was discovered in the city in 2009. And this new synagogue helps scholars understand the deeply Jewish nature of Magdala and the Galilee region as a whole in the first century, a subject that had been widely discussed and debated. Here's an article from the Smithsonian magazine from 2009 about this find and some really nice pictures. You can see that this is kind of the seating area around this table where maybe the Torah scroll would have been read. The Gospels say that Jesus taught in synagogues throughout all Galilee. But despite decades of digging in the towns Jesus visited, no early first century synagogue had ever been found. Until some people found them. Some scholars argued that the synagogues in the New Testament were nothing more than anachronisms. But as Israeli Antiquities Authority official Dinah Avshalom Gorni stood at the edge of the archaeological dig pit, studying the arrangement of benches along the walls, she could no longer deny it. They'd found a synagogue from the time of Jesus in the hometown of Mary Magdalene. These finds mark the first case of the existence of two synagogues in any locality from the Second Temple period. This large stone is a closer-up picture of the stone there for you, possibly functioned as a table for reading Torah scrolls. It's come to be known as the Magdala scroll, and among the images are included one of the earliest depictions of a menorah, of the typically Jewish candle holder. And finally, let's look at this category of historical culture. Quote from the Da Vinci Code. Jesus was viewed by his followers as a mortal prophet, a great and powerful man, but a man nonetheless. Oh, not the Son of God? Right, Professor Teabing says. Jesus' establishment as the Son of God was officially proposed and voted on by the Council of Nicaea, which happened in 325 AD, in the 4th century AD. Let me use the very English phrase, poppycock. Let me show you some archaeology, just debunking that by going to archaeology. This is the 3rd century AD Good Shepherd ring. It's a gold ring with a gemstone showing an image of a young Jesus holding a lamb on his back, known as the Good Shepherd scene, known from quite a lot of Christian art. It's one of several stunning artifacts found off the coast of Israel. The Israeli Antiquities Authority announced it had recovered treasures from 2 shipwrecks, which had been found in the ancient port of Caesarea. The ring, which is some 1,750 years old, was found amongst a trove of 3rd century Roman coins. So that helps date it. Of course, now in Mark chapter 6, for example, we get when Jesus landed and saw the large crowd, he had compassion on them, and because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things, and Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. Now, intertextually, what's going on here is a reference to the Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He leads me. He makes me sit down in green pastures. Right. John 10:11, I'm the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. Again, intertextuality to the Old Testament. God is the shepherd of Israel. The Frankfurt inscription, this was just found last year, or the kind of analysis of it was published last year, let's put it that way. It's a 1,800-year-old, 3.5 centimetre long silver amulet containing a wafer-thin, or if you've watched Monty Python films, a wafer-thin sheet of rolled-up silver foil. It was discovered beneath the chin of a skeleton in a Frankfurt cemetery in 2018, and it's the oldest evidence of Christianity north of the Alps, according to a 2024 published study. Quote, archaeologists discovered it in the grave of a man who died between AD 230 and 270. The man likely wore the amulet on a cord around his neck, as it was found just below his jaw, and you can kind of see the rings that you would have kind of put a thong through to tie it around your neck or whatever. And in 2024, researchers were able to scan and virtually unscroll that foil to read the inscription that was kind of scratched into the silver foil. And here is what the Frankfurt inscription said. And again, the question marks on the bits in brackets are the kind of, that's really hard to read, we're really guessing, right? So perhaps, in the name of Saint Titus, holy, 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 in the name of Jesus Christ, Son of God, the Lord of the world resists with strength all attacks. The God grants entry to well-being. May this means of salvation protect the man who surrenders himself to the will of the Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God. Since before Jesus Christ every knee bows, those in heaven, those on earth, those under the earth, and every tongue confess, well, probably Jesus Christ as Lord. The Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God. Or here's the 3rd century, so 200 and something AD, church at Dura Europos in modern-day Syria. And here you can see there's a baptistry area, and this baptistry has got pictures on the walls, fresco pictures on the walls. Here again is right above the baptistry pool, this image of a young man carrying sheep, the good shepherd. I'm the good shepherd. Mark 6, again the Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. That's dated to about 232 AD. And here's another of the pictures from that baptistry. You can make out a man in a toga with his arm outstretched over a man lying on a quite substantial bed, and next to it, a man carrying his bed. Put you in mind of any biblical story? It's taken quite literally in terms of the culture that they knew. In first century Jerusalem, it was probably roll up your bed mat, not put your bed on your back, But this is clearly a depiction of Jesus healing the paralytic, I think. What's kind of one of the main points about the story of Jesus healing the paralytic? Why does this fellow talk like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? And he said to the paralytic, I tell you, get up and take your mat and go home. Which is it easier to say, your sins are forgiven, or etc.? Like, the point of the story, the nub of the story, is a divinity claim from Jesus' way of talking and behaving, right? Backed up by a miracle. And here it is in this second century house church. Suggests to me that people there probably thought Jesus was divine. Or the Christian mosaic discovered in 2005 near Megiddo, actually in the grounds of Megiddo prison, from 230 AD. There's a kind of reconstruction. We're looking downward here on various mosaic floor around the pillar of a table. Now, interestingly, we have this fish pictures in the middle of one of the big mosaics. And as you'll know, the fish was an early Christian sign because the Greek word ichthus could be used as an acrostic where you take each letter of that word as the beginning of another word. And when you do that, you can use it to spell out, let me translate it to English, Jesus Christ, God's Son, Saviour. And so this Christian imagery of the fish is again probably a reference to people believing that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. But we can be more direct than that, because over here we have an inscription talking about the person who's given money to fund the table and so on. And it says, the God-loving Akeptus has offered the table to God Jesus Christ as a memorial. And in Greek, you didn't underline, you overlined things to emphasize them, and God Jesus Christ is overlined. It's kind of written in short form, but that's what it means. Or around 80 to around about AD 200, so we're going earlier and earlier and earlier here. This is the Alexamenos graffito. It might surprise you to know that graffito is like Latin for graffiti. Wall graffiti from near Palatine Hill in Rome, dated to about AD 200. We have this picture of a human figure with a donkey head, bizarre, being crucified, and someone else kind of looking up at him with a hand upstretched, and the scratched writing says, Alexamenos worships his God. Or maybe, Alexamenos, worship your God. Ha ha ha. So funny that Alexamenos worships this crucified person. Who worships a crucified person? What crucified person from before that time period could you think of that people might worship? Well, there's also a contextual clue here. As the historian Tom Holland points out in his book Dominion, I was really fascinated when I came across this reference. Holland points out that to Greek scholars, the question of what might be found within the Holy of Holies in the Jewish temple was a tantalizing one, because Greco-Roman temples, of course, inside the temple you had a statue of the god. But non-Jews weren't allowed inside the Jewish temple, so there's all this speculation in the Jewish and the Greco-Roman thought world, like, what do the Jews have in their temple? Holland says Poseidonus, never knowingly without a theory, claimed that it contained a golden ass's head. Others believed that it held the stone image of a man with a long beard sitting on a donkey. But there's clearly this association in Greco-Roman thought between the Jewish temple and the Jewish god, an imagery of a donkey, an ass. And here we have somebody worshipping a crucified man with a donkey head, with an ass's head, which suggests, I think, that crucified person is, in the mind of Alexamenos, the Jewish God. Not just a God, but the Jewish God. As Rob Bowman points out, it would never have occurred to anyone in the first century to invent a story about a crucified man as the divine saviour and king of the world. something extreme and dramatic must have happened to lead people to accept such an idea. And here is someone in about 200 AD. And if Jesus died in 33, that's not all that long after. Here's a report from a Life Science website from 2011 talking about researchers identifying what they believe to be the world's earliest surviving Christian inscription, although there's some discussion about to what extent the thought world here is Christian or kind of Gnostic, kind of slightly heretical Christian. It's got the fancy name of NCE 156. That sounds like a starship from Star Trek. The inscription was written in Greek and dated to the latter half of the 2nd century, so like 150 forward AD. It alludes to Christian or Christian-like beliefs, at least. If in fact it's a 2nd century inscription, as I think it probably is, says this researcher, it's about the earliest Christian material object that we possess. Gregory Snyder of Davidson College from North Carolina told Life Science. He detailed the findings in an issue of Journal of Ancient Christian Studies, Early Christian Studies. He thinks it's a funereal epigram that incorporates both Christian and pagan elements. And you know, the past is a different country. It's a bit weird, but go with this. The inscription goes, "To my bath, the brothers of the bridal chamber carry the torches. Here in our halls they hunger for the true banquets, even while praising the Father and glorifying the Son. There, probably with the Father and the Son, is the only spring and source of truth." And think about that in the context of burying someone. But praising the Father and glorifying the Son. And finally, from about AD 79, and we can know that because this comes from Pompeii, and Pompeii was swamped by a volcanic explosion. So that's when, you know, the latest that this could date from. It's known as the Pompeii Rotas or Sator Square. Again, letters scratched in, and they're in a pattern. Found in ancient Roman places, including Cirencester in England and Pompeii. So it dates back at least to AD 79. It's a Latin palindrome. You know, a palindrome is when a word reads the same, it reads differently backwards, or you can go horizontally or vertically when you're kind of reading this square of letters. It has a backwards spelling of rotas opera tenet apero sator, which translates as farmer arepo works the plough. But if you read it in the other direction, you can get other things. And indeed, one may rearrange the letters into a cross shape with N, maybe for the divine name, at the center, as it is in the square. N is in the middle. And the words Our Father, the opening of the Lord's Prayer, and the letters Alpha and Omega at the end, horizontally and vertically, of a kind of cross. Alpha and Omega, divine name, Our Father. According to Revelation 1:8, Jesus says, "I am the Alpha and Omega, who is and was and who is to come, the Almighty." But the letters may also be arranged into a prayer, Orote Pater Sanas. I pray to you, Father, I pray to you, Father, you heal. In which case the symbolism could be Jewish, and you have to look in kind of Ezekiel 1 and 9, Isaiah 46, verse 10. So depending on kind of how you arrange this word puzzle from the 1st century, you could say it's Christian, and it's talking about the divinity of Jesus. Or you could say maybe it's Jewish symbology. And so there's debate about, is this evidence of Christian belief from the 70s AD? So let's put that on a time graph here. We have the crucifixion at AD 33. The Council of Nicaea, well over here in the 4th century. And just look at what archaeology says about what people believed about Jesus. if you interpret the Pompeii Rotas Square in Christian terms, that shows Christian belief about Jesus and his divinity within about 50 years of the crucifixion. But as I say, it's open to interpretation. We go to NCE 156, it's certainly got kind of Christian imagery in it, and then we're looking at about 150, 200 years after the crucifixion. Quite a long time before the Council of Nicaea. Then if we get this kind of conglomeration of evidence of the Alexamenos graffito and then the Megiddo Church and the Duro-Europos Church within about 170, 230 years, still, we're over 100 years before the Council of Nicaea here. Even those who don't go as extreme as the kind of Dan Brown, it was all made up at the Council of Nicaea theory, the Jesus mythicists who say the original disciples thought of him as a human, and then it went out into the Greco-Roman world where ideas about, gods and demigods and so on influenced Christianity, and they kind of gradually divinized him. They want to make that happen over as long a time period as possible, because the quicker that happens, the less plausible that theory is. The more it would have been tied to the original first generation, or people who knew the first generation, and the living witness of what everybody would have known were the disciple of Jesus and so on. Right? So you want to try and separate them as late as possible, maybe not as late as the Council of Nicaea, but I've seen people, mythicists, who will kind of try and put it to like around here. And the archaeology is really kind of a bit of a, like, how long can you put it? Well, maybe you can get past here. This starts getting difficult, and here is really tricky, right? And is 170 years long enough for that process to happen? It puts at least some strain on the theory, I think, just from going to archaeology. But certainly in terms of, I've read Dan Brown, and I know that the theologians just made that up in the Council of Nicaea in the 4th century. It's like, archaeology, boom, right? Let me introduce you to the remains of Johannan. In 1968, this ancient burial site was uncovered with about 35 bodies. Johannan ben Hagagol had a 7-inch nail driven through both feet. He'd been crucified and given an honourable burial, because we found these remains in an ossuary. And many times people will question whether someone who'd been crucified would have been given a decent burial like is described in the Gospels. They say, no, that wouldn't have happened. They would have been just chucked into the kind of local communal grave pit or whatever. But here's one of the few archaeological evidences of crucifixion that we have, and it just happens to be of someone who is decently buried. He was crucified and given an honourable burial in the 1st century AD. And then in December 2021, they announced that the skeleton of a crucified man had been excavated from a grave in Fen Stanton in Cambridgeshire in England. The remains had a nail driven through the back of the right foot. Radiocarbon dates suggested the victim was executed probably in about 250 AD. So there's a kind of our second archaeological example of crucifixion as a form of execution, this time from England. And of course he was excavated from a grave site, I believe. Talking of grave sites, Jesus' empty tomb. Yes, this is a place technically, but I'm going to consider it at this juncture. Dan Bahat, who's the former city archaeologist of Jerusalem, says, we may not be absolutely certain that the site of the Holy Sepulchre Church is the site of Jesus' burial, but we've got no other site that can lay name to such a weighty claim. Basically, no reason to reject the authenticity of this site. And the very nice to visit garden tomb that you may know about or have even visited in Jerusalem may give you a better idea of what the kind of early grave sites looked like and felt like, but is actually too early to have been where Jesus was buried. mortar, they've been renovating this recently, and mortar from the 2016 renovation was dated to as early as AD 345. We know when the Romans came in, having conquered Jerusalem, they tried to eradicate Judaism from it, and at this stage, of course, Christianity was just seen as another form of Judaism. So they built a temple, I think it was a temple to Aphrodite, over this site because of its association with this Jewish messianic figure. Like, we'll eradicate that, we'll put a temple to Aphrodite on top of it, and of course that helped the local Christians memorialize, where was Jesus buried? Oh yeah, it was that place with the temple of Aphrodite on top of it. And so they dated the mortar from that 4th century date, so the tradition goes back at least to then. And indeed, in renovating the place, they uncovered the cracked marble slab that actually had covered the limescale shelf from the tomb that they think is the tomb that this place memorialized. So that's probably the limescale shelf on which Jesus' dead body lay. And a National Geographic archaeologist says it appears to be proof that the location of the tomb hasn't shifted through time, something we'd wondered about. And then very recently, this was announced just like in March. In John's Gospel, you get, for example, in John 19 to 20, now in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden. Just a little offhanded detail. Times of Israel reporting on the archaeology happening under Professor Francesca Romana Stassola from La Sapienza University. She says, as the quarry ceased to be exploited and before the church was built on top of it, as well as for several tombs in this disused stone quarry, part of the area was used for agriculture. Low stone walls were erected. The space between them was then filled with dirt, and then gardening happened. The presence of olive trees and grapevines was identified through archaeobotanical and pollen analysis on samples retrieved from the excavations under the floor of the ancient basilica. From the archaeological context and the strata, it belongs to the pre-Christian era. She says, the archaeobotanical findings have been especially interesting in light of what's mentioned in the Gospel of John. John mentions a green area between Calvary and the tomb. Thank you. And we identified these cultivated fields. And think of Mary thinking that the resurrected Jesus was who? The gardener. And you might have read that and it's like, this is a graveyard. Why is there a gardener? Tending, it's not like our kind of graveyards where you need someone to stop the flowers overgrowing the tombstones. They put people into caves, rolled a big stone in front of it, went and left it for a year before they came back. So this is why. And then we have the Nazareth inscription, so called because it was found in Nazareth, very likely written during the reign of the Emperor Claudius in the 1st century AD. He reigned from 41 to 54. And it forbids, under penalty of death, the robbing of bodies from tombs. That's a kind of increase on the pre-existing punishment for tomb robbery. And that makes sense in light of the Jewish argument that Jesus' body had been stolen by the disciples. We see that story reported in Matthew 28. Again, of course, there's discussion over the interpretation of this, but, for example, historian Clyde Billington, I've read his paper on this, which I think is quite a good one to go to. He says the Nazareth inscription was almost certainly issued by Claudius in response to the story of the resurrection of Jesus. So to summarize, just looking at the archaeological evidence and seeing how does that relate to what the Gospels say, the archaeological evidence seems to indicate or verify, yes, varying degrees of plausibility, the following. That Jesus, son of Joseph and brother of James, who was himself buried in Jerusalem in the middle of the 1st century, existed somewhere around the middle of the 1st century. That Jesus was crucified. that a crucifixion victim could be given a decent burial. That Jesus was buried in a tomb just outside the city walls of Jerusalem at the time. Interestingly, just after Jesus' time, they had an expansion of the city walls, and that area then moved within the city walls of Jerusalem. But in Jesus' day, it was without the city walls. In a disused quarry with a garden. Grave robbery was an offence that may have been particularly associated with Nazareth, where the New Testament says Jesus lived, mid-first century. That some people thought Jesus was divine in the Judeo-Christian sense within 50 to 170 years of his highly culturally embarrassing crucifixion. And that is a puzzle. And that the first century canonical biographies of Jesus, the only first century biographies we have of him, have been repeatedly verified by archaeological discoveries relating to places and people and culture and beliefs and people's titles, which encourages us to trust those biographies even when we can't independently verify them. Yeah. So isn't it astonishing that you really get a kind of outline of the basics of what the New Testament communicates about Jesus just by going and looking at archaeology, and that you can debunk some of those popular cultural myths that float around on TikTok and other places these days, and in books by mythicists and Dan Brown and so on, just by going to the archaeology.